The distant howl of a lone wolf pierced the crisp autumn air as Ruby Redmond clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, her sunken eyes scanning the darkening horizon. The meager warmth it provided was nothing compared to the cold dread that had taken up permanent residence in her heart. Tucked behind her in the dilapidated wagon were her 3 hungry children, their once boisterous spirits dampened by days of near starvation. The journey to Deming, New Mexico territory, had stripped Ruby of her last coins, her last hope, and nearly her last breath. It was 1878, and the promise of a new beginning after her husband's death had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh southwestern sun. Ruby had sold everything except the clothes on their backs, and her husband's pocket watched the last remnant of a life that seemed like a distant dream now. "Mama, I'm hungry," whispered 7-year-old Emma, her small hand tugging at Ruby's faded dress. Ruby swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. Emma's younger brothers, 4-year-old Thomas and 2-year-old Jacob, had already cried themselves to sleep, their small bodies curled together for warmth in the back of the wagon. "I know, darling. We'll be in town soon, and then—" Ruby's voice trailed off. She had no idea what would happen then. The few dollars she had tucked into her boot wouldn't last more than a day or two. Her skills as a seamstress meant nothing in a town where she knew no one, had no reputation, and owned no sewing machine. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the distant mountains when Ruby finally saw the scattered lights of Deming. The small town sat like an oasis in the vast New Mexico desert, promising shelter if not salvation. The wheels of her wagon creaked in protest as she guided her exhausted horse down the main street. The animal, like its owners, had gone too long without proper nourishment. Ruby pulled the wagon to a stop near the town well, her arms trembling with fatigue as she set the brake. "Emma, stay with your brothers. I'm going to get some water." As Ruby approached the well, she noticed a small crowd gathered outside the town's only saloon. Laughter spilled out into the street along with the tinny sound of a piano. Ruby kept her head down, unwilling to draw attention as she worked the well pump. The water that splashed into her bucket was the first blessing she'd received in weeks. "Madam, you look like you could use some help." The deep voice startled her, and Ruby nearly dropped the bucket. She turned to find herself looking up into the face of a tall man with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. His broad shoulders were draped in a worn leather coat, and a cowboy hat sat atop his sun-bronzed face. Despite her wariness of strangers, something in his gentle expression made Ruby's tense shoulders relax slightly. "Thank you, sir, but we're managing." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "The name's Benjamin Caldwell, but folks around here just call me Ben." He tipped his hat slightly. "And managing looks different where I come from." Ruby clutched the water bucket closer, her pride still intact despite everything. "Ruby Redmond, my children and I are just passing through." Ben's eyes flickered to the wagon where Emma's small face peered out curiously. "Those your little ones." "How many you got there?" "3, Ruby answered, her defenses rising. "And we'll be just fine once we—" Her words were cut short by a loud rumble from her empty stomach. The betrayal of her own body brought a flush of embarrassment to Ruby's pale cheeks. Ben's expression softened further, but there was no pity in his eyes, only genuine concern. "Miss Redmond, I don't mean to overstep, but my ranch is just outside of town. I've got a hot meal on the table and plenty to spare." He gestured toward the darkening sky. "Night's coming on fast, and it gets mighty cold out here." Ruby shook her head automatically. "I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition if it's freely offered." Ben's voice was gentle but firm. He looked past her to the wagon again, where Emma had been joined by a newly awakened Thomas. Their hollow cheeks and large, hungry eyes told a story that Ruby couldn't hide. "My table has room for all of you." Ruby blinked rapidly, fighting back tears of both pride and relief. "Why would you help strangers?" Ben adjusted his hat and glanced briefly at the star pinned to his vest that Ruby hadn't noticed before. "Well, being the sheriff means looking out for folks, but truth be told, I'd do it anyway." A hint of sadness passed over his features. I know what it's like to go hungry. Something in his honest gaze broke through the walls Ruby had built around herself during the long, desperate journey. Her children hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Could she really refuse help when their small bodies were growing weaker by the hour? Just for tonight, she conceded softly, her voice barely audible over the evening breeze. And I can work to repay your kindness. I'm a skilled seamstress. Ben nodded, a smile warming his weathered face. That's settled then. He moved toward her wagon with purpose. Let me help you get this old girl hitched to my horse. Mine's got more strength for the journey to the ranch. As Ben transferred her meager belongings to his stronger mount, Ruby gathered her children, whispering assurances that they would soon have food in their bellies. Emma's eyes lit up with hope for the first time in weeks, while the boys simply clung to their mother, too exhausted to show much reaction. The journey to Ben's ranch took less than an hour, but to Ruby's tired body, it felt much longer. Ben rode alongside, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of information about Deming and the surrounding area. His deep voice was soothing in the gathering darkness, and despite her wariness, Ruby found herself grateful for his steady presence. The Caldwell Ranch emerged from the darkness like a vision, a sturdy two-story house with warm light glowing from the windows. A large barn stood nearby, and various outbuildings dotted the property. It wasn't an opulent estate, but to Ruby's eyes it looked like paradise compared to the endless road they'd been traveling. It's not much, Ben said as he helped her down from the wagon, but it's home. Ruby surveyed the well-maintained property with disbelief. Not much, it's wonderful. Ben smiled, a touch of pride in his expression. Been in the Caldwell family for 2 generations now. My pa built it, and I've been adding to it bit by bit. As they approached the house, the front door swung open, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a kind face stepped onto the porch. Benjamin Caldwell, I was starting to worry. Supper's been ready this past. She stopped short when she spotted Ruby and the children. Mrs. Holbrook, we have guests tonight, Ben explained. This is Miss Ruby Redmond and her children. The woman's surprise quickly melted into a warm smile. Well then, it's fortunate I made extra stew. Come in before you catch your death in this night air. The interior of the ranch house was just as inviting as its exterior. A large fireplace dominated the main room, casting a golden glow over sturdy wooden furniture. The smell of fresh bread and hearty stew made Ruby's mouth water, and she heard Thomas make a small whimpering sound of hunger beside her. Mrs. Holbrook is my housekeeper, Ben explained as the woman bustled about, adding another plate to the large dining table. Has been since my mother passed 10 years ago. More like I'm his keeper, Mrs. Holbrook corrected with a fond smile. Someone has to make sure this man eats something besides beef jerky when he's working. The casual banter between them spoke of years of comfortable companionship, and Ruby felt a twinge of longing for such security. It had been so long since she'd had anyone to rely on besides herself. Now, you young ones come sit right here, Mrs. Holbrook said, guiding Emma and Thomas to chairs that had been boosted with cushions. Jacob, still half asleep, remained in Ruby's arms until a smaller chair with arms was produced from another room. This was Benjamin's when he was a little one, Mrs. Holbrook explained as she helped settle Jacob. Hasn't been used in some 30 years, but I keep it dusted just the same. Ruby sat down gingerly, overwhelmed by the kindness being shown to her family. When Ben placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of her, the rich aroma nearly brought her to tears. She helped her younger children with their spoons while fighting the urge to devour her own portion in undignified haste. Ben sat at the head of the table, his presence reassuring rather than intimidating. Mrs. Holbrook makes the best venison stew in the territory, he said, breaking a piece of bread and passing the loaf to Ruby. The meal passed in relative quiet, interrupted only by Jacob's occasional happy babble as he discovered the joy of a full stomach. Ruby noticed that Ben watched them with a gentle expression, never commenting on how quickly they ate or how many helpings the children accepted. When the meal was finished, Mrs. Holbrook shooed the children into the kitchen to help with a simple task of sorting spoons, clearly a ruse to give the adults a moment to talk privately. "Miss Redmond," Ben began, his voice low and respectful. "I don't mean to pry, but it seems to me you're in a tight spot." Ruby's hands twisted in her lap. The food in her stomach felt like a debt she couldn't repay. "My husband Daniel died of fever last spring. We had a small farm in Missouri, but the bank took it when I couldn't keep up with the payments." The simplified version of her tragedy spared the details of months of struggle, of selling her wedding ring to buy medicine that hadn't saved Daniel anyway, of neighbors who had turned their backs when her situation grew desperate. "And you came west looking for a fresh start," Ben finished for her. "It wasn't a question. Yes, I heard there were opportunities in New Mexico territory. I have family in California, but—" She trailed off, unwilling to admit she'd never make it that far with their dwindling resources. Ben nodded thoughtfully. "Deming's growing. We've got the railroad coming through soon. There might be opportunities for someone with sewing skills." Hope flickered in Ruby's chest. "Do you really think so?" "I do, and as it happens, Mrs. Holbrook was just saying yesterday that she can't keep up with all the mending that needs doing around here." Ben's eyes held a question. "The old bunkhouse has been fixed up nice. It's small, but it would give you and your children a roof while you get on your feet." Ruby stared at him, unable to process the offer. "You'd let us stay, but you don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Ben said simply. "I know you're a mother who's doing everything she can for her children. That tells me all I need to know about your character." Tears welled in Ruby's eyes, and this time she couldn't hold them back. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks. We help each other out here. That's how we survive." Ben's smile was warm, without a hint of charity or condescension. "Now, Mrs. Holbrook has probably already made up beds for you all, so why don't you get some rest? Things always look brighter in the morning." That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in weeks, with her children sleeping soundly beside her, Ruby allowed herself to believe that perhaps their luck had finally changed. As she drifted off to sleep, the image of Ben Caldwell's kind eyes followed her into her dreams. The morning light streamed through the small window of the bunkhouse, painting golden stripes across the worn wooden floor. Ruby awoke with a moment of disorientation before the events of the previous night came rushing back. Her children still slept deeply, their faces peaceful in a way she hadn't seen in months. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Quickly smoothing her hair and straightening her wrinkled dress, Ruby opened the door to find Mrs. Holbrook holding a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Good morning, dear. Thought you might appreciate some breakfast." The older woman handed over the basket, which emanated the mouth-watering scent of fresh biscuits. "Benjamin's already been up for hours. That man rises before the roosters. He asked me to tell you to take your time settling in. The children must be exhausted from your travels." "Thank you, Mrs. Holbrook. Your kindness is—" Ruby's voice caught. "It's more than I expected to find." Mrs. Holbrook's eyes softened. "Well, Benjamin's always had a big heart, too big sometimes if you ask me. But in this case, I think he's right to offer you folks a place to stay." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Besides, that man has been living like a hermit these past years. Some young energy around the place will do him good." As Mrs. Holbrook bustled away, Ruby pondered her words. There was clearly a story behind Ben's solitary life, but Ruby had her own troubles to focus on. She turned back to wake her children for breakfast, determined to find a way to repay the sheriff's generosity. The next few days fell into a pattern that felt almost surreal to Ruby after months of uncertainty. Mrs. Holbrook showed her the piles of mending that had accumulated, everything from Ben's torn shirts to frayed tablecloths. With nimble fingers that remembered their skill despite her hardships, Ruby set to work, grateful for the chance to be useful. Ben himself was often absent during daylight hours, fulfilling his duties as sheriff in town. But in the evenings, he would return, sometimes with small gifts for the children, a wooden toy he'd carved for Jacob, a ribbon for Emma's hair, a book of adventure stories for Thomas. He never made a fuss about these gestures, simply presenting them as afterthoughts, but Ruby noticed how her children's faces lit up when they heard the sound of his horse approaching. On the fourth evening, Ruby was sitting on the small porch of the bunkhouse, her mending basket beside her as she took advantage of the last daylight. Ben approached from the main house, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. "Evening, Miss Redmond," he greeted, removing his hat as he drew near. "Mind if I join you?" Ruby gestured to the space beside her. "Please do, and after all your kindness, I think you might call me Ruby." A smile tugged at Ben's mouth as he settled his large frame onto the step. "Ruby it is, then." He glanced at her basket. "Mrs. Holbrook tells me you've nearly worked your way through that mountain of mending already." "It's the least I can do," Ruby replied, setting aside the shirt she'd been repairing, "though I fear my debt to you grows larger each day we stay." Ben shook his head firmly. "There's no debt between neighbors, Ruby." "Is that what we are, neighbors?" she asked softly. "For as long as you want to be." Ben's gaze was steady. "I meant what I said about opportunities in Deming. The Sanders family owns the general store in town. They've been talking about bringing in fabrics and sewing supplies, but they need someone with the skills to make it worthwhile." Ruby's heart quickened. "Are you suggesting?" "I mentioned your skills to Mr. Sanders yesterday. He's interested in meeting you." Ben looked pleased with himself. "Could be the start of something good for you and the children." The possibility of real work, of independence, sent a surge of hope through Ruby that was almost painful in its intensity. "Ben, I don't know how to thank you. Seeing you and those little ones with food in your bellies and smiles on your faces is thanks enough." He paused, seeming to debate his next words. "My mother always said a house isn't really a home until there's children's laughter in it. This place has been too quiet for too long." Ruby studied his profile in the fading light, noting the strong line of his jaw, the small scar near his temple, the way his eyes seemed to hold both strength and gentleness. "You never married?" she asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "No need to apologize." Ben looked out toward the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "I was engaged once, about 8 years ago. Elizabeth was her name. She was a schoolteacher from back east, came out here full of ideas about educating frontier children." A sad smile crossed his face. "She wasn't prepared for how hard life can be out here. When winter came and brought sickness with it, she was one of the first to fall ill, didn't make it to spring." "I'm so sorry," Ruby said softly, understanding all too well the pain of losing someone you loved. "After that, I guess I threw myself into being sheriff, into making this ranch work. Didn't leave much time for courting." Ben turned to look at her directly. "What about you? How did you meet your husband?" The simple question opened a flood of memories. "Daniel and I grew up on neighboring farms. We'd known each other all our lives. When he asked me to marry him, it felt like the most natural thing in the world." Ruby twisted her hands in her lap, the phantom weight of her missing wedding ring a constant reminder of all she'd lost. "He was a good man, a good father. He didn't deserve to die so young." "Life isn't much concerned with what people deserve," Ben observed quietly. "Otherwise, you and those children wouldn't have had to suffer so." They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. Emma's voice called from inside the bunkhouse, asking for help with Jacob's nightclothes. "I should go," Ruby said, gathering her mending basket. "The children need their bath before bed." Ben stood, offering his hand to help her up. The brief touch of his calloused fingers against hers sent an unexpected warmth through Ruby's arm. "I'll ride into town with you tomorrow, introduce you to the Sanders if you'd like." "I would appreciate that very much," Ruby replied, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. In the dim light, Ben's eyes seemed to hold a question that made her heart beat faster. The moment was broken by Thomas bursting out of the bunkhouse door. "Mama!" Jacob's trying to eat soap again, Ben chuckled as Ruby quickly excused herself to handle the crisis. As she herded her son back inside, she glanced over her shoulder to find Ben still standing there, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. That night, after the children were asleep, Ruby sat by the window, looking out at the main house where a single light still burned. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something beyond fear and exhaustion. It was a dangerous feeling, this spark of attraction to a man who had shown her family such kindness. Dangerous because it made her vulnerable in ways she'd promised herself she wouldn't be again. But as she finally lay down to sleep, Ruby couldn't help wondering if perhaps Ben Caldwell felt that same spark too. The ride into Deming the next morning was filled with nervous anticipation for Ruby. She had dressed in her least worn dress, a faded blue calico that had once been quite pretty. Mrs. Holbrook had insisted on keeping the children for the day, promising to teach Emma some simple cooking and to keep the boys entertained with stories and small chores they could help with. "You look nice," Ben commented as he helped Ruby onto the wagon seat beside him. The simple compliment brought color to her cheeks. "It's not much, but it's the best I have," she admitted. "It's not the dress that matters," Ben replied, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he clicked his tongue to set the horses in motion. The town of Deming looked different in the daylight than it had when Ruby arrived that desperate evening. What had seemed small and intimidating now appeared busy and full of possibility. The main street was lined with buildings in various states of construction or renovation, evidence of the growth Ben had mentioned. "Railroads changed everything," Ben explained as they traveled down the street. 2 years ago, this was just a water stop. "Now we've got folks coming from all over to start fresh." "Like me," Ruby murmured. "Exactly like you," Ben agreed. "Except you've got something many of them don't." "What's that?" "Grit." The admiration in his voice was unmistakable. "Takes a special kind of courage to pack up 3 little ones and head west on your own." Before Ruby could respond, Ben pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a large storefront with Sanders General Merchandise painted across the front window. "Here we are. The Sanders are good people. Honest in their dealings." As they entered the store, the bell above the door announced their arrival. A middle-aged man with spectacles looked up from behind the counter, his face breaking into a smile when he recognized Ben. "Sheriff Caldwell, good to see you." The man's curious gaze shifted to Ruby. "Mr. Sanders, this is Miss Ruby Redmond, the seamstress I was telling you about." Ben placed a reassuring hand at the small of Ruby's back, guiding her forward. The gentle pressure gave her courage. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Redmond." Mr. Sanders extended his hand. "Ben here says you've got a talent with needle and thread." Ruby shook his hand firmly. "I've been sewing since I was a child, sir. My mother taught me, and I've made everything from wedding dresses to work shirts." Mr. Sanders nodded approvingly. "My wife's been after me to expand our dry goods section. With the railroad bringing in more families, there's growing demand for quality sewing work." He gestured toward a door at the back of the store. "Martha's in the storeroom. She'll want to talk to you herself." Ben gave Ruby an encouraging nod. "I've got some business at the jail. I'll come back for you in about an hour." Ruby squared her shoulders. "Thank you, Ben." As Ben left the store, Mr. Sanders led Ruby to the back room where Mrs. Sanders, a plump woman with bright eyes and capable hands, was inventorying bolts of fabric. The next hour was a whirlwind of conversation about fabrics, techniques, and the needs of the growing town. By the time Ben returned, Ruby had not only secured work as the store's seamstress, but had also been offered a small room behind the shop where she could set up her workstation. "I can't pay much at first," Mrs. Sanders explained apologetically, "but as business grows, so will your portion." "It's more than fair," Ruby assured her, hardly able to believe her good fortune. "When can I start?" "How about day after tomorrow?" Mrs. Sanders suggested. "That will give us time to clear out the back room and bring in a proper sewing table for you." When Ruby emerged from the store, her face was flushed with excitement. Ben was waiting outside, leaning against a post with his hat tipped low over his eyes. He straightened when he saw her, a questioning look on his face. "They hired me." Ruby couldn't contain her joy. "I start the day after tomorrow. They're even providing a sewing machine." The smile that spread across Ben's face was as bright as the sun overhead. "I knew they would. They'd be fools not to." On impulse, Ruby threw her arms around him in a quick, grateful embrace. "Thank you, Ben. This wouldn't have happened without you." Ben's arms came around her for just a moment before they both seemed to remember they were standing on the main street of Deming. They stepped apart, Ruby suddenly self-conscious about her display of emotion. "I just made the introduction," Ben said modestly. "The rest was all you." The ride back to the ranch was filled with Ruby's excited chatter about her plans for the job. Ben listened attentively, offering suggestions about which families in town might need her services and which might be able to pay the best. "The children and I can move into town once I've saved enough for rent," Ruby mused, already calculating how long it might take to establish herself. A shadow seemed to pass over Ben's expression. "There's no rush," he said after a moment. "The bunkhouse is yours for as long as you need it." Ruby studied his profile, wondering at the note of what almost sounded like disappointment in his voice. "It's very generous of you, but I can't impose indefinitely." "It's not an imposition." Ben's eyes remained on the road ahead. "Truth is, Mrs. Holbrook has taken a shine to your little ones. She'd be devastated if you left too soon." Ruby smiled, suspecting it wasn't just Mrs. Holbrook who would miss their presence. "Well, we certainly won't be going anywhere until I've built up some savings. That could take months." "Months sounds just fine," Ben replied, and the tension seemed to leave his shoulders. As they approached the ranch, they could see Emma chasing Thomas around the yard while Mrs. Holbrook sat on the porch with Jacob in her lap. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that Ruby felt a lump form in her throat. How long had it been since her children had played without the weight of worry hanging over them? That evening, after the children were bathed and fed, Ben appeared at the bunkhouse door with a large wooden crate. "Found this in the attic," he explained, setting it down on the small table. "Thought your young ones might enjoy these." Ruby opened the crate to find it filled with children's books, wooden toys, and even a small rag doll with button eyes. "These were yours?" she asked, lifting out a carved wooden horse. Ben shook his head, a flicker of sadness crossing his features. "My wife and I, Elizabeth, we were planning for a family. She started collecting these things as soon as we were engaged." He touched the doll gently. "Seems a shame for them to stay packed away when there are children here who could enjoy them." The gesture was so thoughtful, so personal, that Ruby found herself momentarily speechless. "Ben, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let those kids be kids for a while," he replied simply. "They've had to grow up too fast." Emma, who had been hovering nearby, approached the crate with wide eyes. When Ben nodded permission, she carefully lifted out the doll, cradling it as if it were made of gold rather than scraps of cloth. "What do you say, Emma?" Ruby prompted gently. "Thank you, Sheriff Ben," Emma whispered, clutching the doll to her chest. "You're very welcome, Miss Emma," Ben replied with a formal tip of his hat that made the little girl giggle. Later, after the children had exclaimed over each treasure and finally fallen asleep surrounded by their new toys, Ruby stepped outside to find Ben still there, sitting on the porch steps and looking up at the stars. "They're asleep," she said softly, joining him on the step. "I haven't seen them this happy in a very long time." "Children are resilient," Ben observed. "Give them safety and a little kindness and they bounce back quick." Ruby wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the night chill. "Not all kindness is equal, Ben Caldwell. What you've done for us goes beyond ordinary decency." Ben was quiet for a long moment. "When Elizabeth died, I thought that was the end of my chance for a family. I threw myself into being sheriff, into running this ranch, told myself it was enough." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "But seeing you with your children these past days has reminded me of what I'd given up hoping for." The honesty of his words took Ruby's breath away. "Ben, I'm not saying this to put any obligation on you, he added quickly. You've got enough on your plate getting back on your feet. I just wanted you to understand why having you all here means something to me. Ruby reached out hesitantly, placing her hand over his where it rested on his knee. We're the ones who are grateful, Ben. You saved us when no one else would even look our way. His hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that felt both surprising and inevitable. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars while the night creatures sang around them. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity as Ruby settled into her new role at Sanders' General Merchandise. True to her word, Mrs. Sanders had cleared out a small room at the back of the store and furnished it with a sewing table, a chair, and most importantly, a functioning sewing machine, a luxury Ruby had never owned even in better times. Word of a skilled seamstress spread quickly through Deming, and soon Ruby had more orders than she could keep up with. Women came to her for dresses and children's clothing, while men sheepishly brought shirts and trousers in need of mending or alteration. Ruby worked diligently, saving every penny she could while still providing better food and occasional small treats for her children. Ben drove her to town each morning and picked her up each evening, claiming it was on his way to and from his sheriff duties. Ruby suspected he adjusted his schedule specifically to accommodate her, but she didn't call attention to it. Those daily rides had become a cherished part of her routine, a time when they could talk without interruption. She learned that Ben had come west with his parents as a boy, that his father had been one of the first ranchers in the area. She heard stories of his early days as a deputy, of the challenges of bringing law to a frontier town, of his dreams for Deming's future. In turn, she shared memories of her life in Missouri, of Daniel's gentle nature, of her hopes for her children's education. What began as friendship deepened with each passing day. Ruby found herself watching the clock in the afternoon, anticipating Ben's arrival. She noticed the way his eyes sought her out when he entered a room, the way his smile seemed reserved especially for her. The children, too, had formed an attachment to the tall sheriff. Thomas followed Ben like a shadow whenever he was doing chores around the ranch, solemnly handing him tools and asking endless questions. Emma had appointed herself his special helper, setting the table for dinner and making sure his coffee cup was always filled. Even little Jacob would toddle to the door when he heard Ben's horse approaching, calling out, "Ben, Ben," in his baby voice. One Sunday in late October, Ben suggested a picnic by the small creek that ran through the eastern edge of his property. The day was unusually warm for autumn, a last gift before winter set in. Mrs. Holbrook packed a generous basket, and Ben hitched the wagon for the short journey. The spot he chose was idyllic, a grassy bank beside the gently flowing water, shaded by cottonwood trees whose leaves had turned golden. The children immediately raced to the water's edge, squealing with delight as they discovered tiny fish darting in the shallows. "Be careful not to fall in," Ruby called after them, spreading the blanket Mrs. Holbrook had provided. "I'll keep an eye on them," Ben assured her, moving to stand where he could watch the children's explorations while Ruby arranged their meal. The simple picnic, fried chicken, fresh bread, early autumn apples tasted better in the open air. The children ate with enthusiasm before running off to play again, leaving Ruby and Ben sitting side by side on the blanket. "I got a letter from the territorial governor yesterday," Ben said after a comfortable silence. "Railroads definitely coming through next spring. Going to change everything for Deming. For the better, I hope," Ruby replied, watching as Thomas showed Emma how to skip stones across the water. "Mostly, yes. More opportunities, more families settling." Ben picked up a blade of grass, twirling it between his fingers. "But change always brings challenges too. More people means more troubles for a sheriff to handle." Ruby studied his thoughtful expression. "You love this land, don't you?" Ben nodded. "It's in my blood now, can't imagine being anywhere else." He looked at her directly. "What about you, Ruby? Do you think you could be happy here?" In Deming, I mean. The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Ruby considered it carefully. When I first arrived, I was so desperate I couldn't think beyond the next meal for my children. But now. She gazed around at the landscape, the distant mountains, the vast sky. Now I can see why you love it. There's a freedom here, a sense of possibility. And your plans to continue to California, to join your family there. Ben's voice was carefully neutral. Ruby hadn't thought about those distant relatives in weeks. They were never expecting us. It was just a destination I fixed on when I had to leave Missouri. She smiled softly. Deming seems like a fine place to put down roots. The hope that bloomed in Ben's eyes made Ruby's heart flutter. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear that had escaped her simple bun. The touch lingered, his fingers trailing along her cheek. Ruby, his words were cut short by a shrill scream from the direction of the creek. They both leapt to their feet as Emma's panicked voice called out, "Mama, Thomas fell in." Ben was already running before Ruby could move, covering the distance to the creek in long strides. Ruby followed, heart in her throat, to find Thomas had slipped from the bank into a deeper pool. The boy was flailing, clearly unable to touch bottom, his face a mask of terror. Without hesitation, Ben plunged into the water. In seconds, he had Thomas in his arms and was carrying him back to the shore. The boy was sputtering and crying but appeared otherwise unharmed. Ben set him gently on the grass where Ruby immediately wrapped her arms around her son, checking him for injuries. "He's all right," Ben assured her, water streaming from his soaked clothing. "Creek's not deep enough to be truly dangerous, but it gave him a good scare." Ruby held Thomas close, her own heart still racing. "Thank you, Ben, if you hadn't been here." "But I was," he said simply, ruffling Thomas's wet hair. "And next time, young man, you'll remember to stay back from the edge like your mama told you, right?" Thomas nodded solemnly, still clinging to Ruby. Emma hovered anxiously nearby, her face pale with fright, while Jacob, too young to understand the danger, tried to splash in the puddle forming around Ben's boots. "We should get him home and into dry clothes," Ruby said, still shaken by the close call. Ben nodded, lifting Jacob into his arms to keep him from the water. "Picnic's over, I reckon. Emma, can you help your mama pack up while I get the wagon?" The ride back to the ranch was subdued, Thomas wrapped in a blanket and nestled against Ruby's side. By the time they reached the house, his fright had passed enough for him to begin recounting his adventure with growing embellishment, much to Ben's amusement. "And then Sheriff Ben jumped in like a real hero and saved me from drowning," Thomas declared as Mrs. Holbrook fussed over him, insisting on a warm bath and hot tea. "Is that so?" Mrs. Holbrook raised an eyebrow at Ben, who had changed into dry clothes but whose hair was still damp. "Seems our sheriff can't go a single day without finding someone to rescue." Ruby caught Ben's eye over the children's heads, a silent acknowledgement passing between them of what might have happened and what had almost been said before the interruption. The moment at the creek had changed something, crystallized feelings that had been growing between them for weeks. Later that evening, after the excitement had died down and the children were tucked safely in bed, Ruby found Ben sitting on the porch of the main house, a cup of coffee in his hands. "Mrs. Holbrook said I'd find you here," Ruby said softly. "I wanted to thank you again for today." Ben set his cup aside and stood. "No need for thanks, Ruby. I'm just glad the boy's all right. It's not just today," she continued, moving closer. "It's everything since the moment we met. You've changed our lives, Ben." The moonlight cast his features in silver and shadow, but Ruby could see the emotion in his eyes. "You've changed mine too," he admitted. "This place was just a house before you and those children came along. Now it feels like a home again." Ruby's heart pounded in her chest as Ben took a step toward her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. "Before we were interrupted today," he said, his voice low, "I was about to tell you something important." He took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "I know it hasn't been long and you might think it's too soon, but I can't keep it to myself any longer. I've fallen in love with you, Ruby Redmond, you and those 3 amazing children of yours." Ruby's breath caught in her throat. Part of her had known this was coming, had felt it building between them, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real in a way that both terrified and exhilarated her. "Ben, she began, then faltered, overcome by the conflicting emotions swirling within her. "I care for you deeply. The children adore you, but I've been on my own for so long, responsible for everything. And you're afraid to trust again," Ben finished for her. "I understand that, Ruby. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. Just for you to know how I feel and to think about what you want for your future, for all your futures." His understanding, his patience, only made Ruby's heart swell further with affection for this good man. On impulse, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. "I will think about it," she promised. "But Ben, you should know I'm already more than halfway to loving you too." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a gentlemanly restraint that made Ruby's pulse quicken. "That's enough for tonight," he said softly. "We've got time, Ruby, all the time we need." As she walked back to the bunkhouse under the starlit sky, Ruby felt lighter than she had in years. The future, which had seemed so bleak just weeks ago, now stretched before her, filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. November brought colder weather and preparations for winter to the Caldwell ranch. Ruby continued her work at the Sanders store, her reputation growing to the point where women from outlying homesteads would travel specifically to commission her work. The income allowed her to buy warm winter clothes for her children, and to start a small savings account at the newly established Deming Bank, a tangible security she hadn't possessed since Daniel's death. Ben, true to his word, had not pressed Ruby for an answer to his declaration. Instead, he seemed content to let their relationship develop naturally, integrating himself into the family's daily life with a patience that only deepened Ruby's growing feelings for him. They shared meals, worked together on ranch chores, and spent quiet evenings reading to the children or simply talking after the little ones were asleep. Gradually, Ruby found herself lowering the defensive walls she'd built around her heart. The memory of Daniel remained, but the sharp pain of loss had softened into a gentle remembrance that no longer overshadowed her present happiness. One crisp morning in late November, Ruby was at her sewing table in the back of Sanders' store when Mrs. Sanders appeared with an anxious expression. "Ruby, dear, the sheriff's outside asking for you. Says it's urgent." Ruby's heart lurched with immediate fear for her children, but she forced herself to remain calm as she set aside her work and hurried to the front of the store. Ben stood just inside the doorway, his expression serious but not grim. "Ben, what is it? Are the children are fine," he assured her quickly. "But something's happened that concerns you. Can you come with me to the jail?" Puzzled and still uneasy, Ruby gathered her shawl and followed Ben down the street to the small building that served as Deming's jail and sheriff's office. Inside, she was surprised to find a well-dressed stranger seated in a chair across from Ben's desk. "Ruby, this is Mr. Harlow." "He's a lawyer from Kansas City," Ben explained, his tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Harlow, this is Miss Ruby Redmond." The man stood, extending his hand. "Miss Redmond, I'm very pleased to finally meet you. I've been searching for you for nearly 2 months." Ruby shook his hand automatically, confusion evident on her face. "Searching for me? I don't understand." "Please sit down," Ben said gently, guiding her to a chair. He remained standing beside her, a reassuring presence. Mr. Harlow resumed his seat, opening a leather portfolio he had placed on Ben's desk. "Miss Redmond, I represent the estate of Jonathan Redmond, your late husband's uncle. Mr. Redmond passed away in September, and in his will he left his entire estate to your husband, Daniel. Upon learning of Daniel's passing, the inheritance transfers to you as his widow and to your children." Ruby stared at the lawyer in disbelief. "Jonathan Redmond, Daniel mentioned him once or twice, but they weren't close. I never even met the man. Nevertheless, you are his legal heir." Mr. Harlow extracted a document from his portfolio. Mr. Redmond was a successful merchant in Kansas City. His estate includes a substantial amount of cash, property, and business interests. The total value is approximately $30,000. The sum was so far beyond Ruby's comprehension that she couldn't process it. She turned to Ben, who looked as stunned as she felt. 30,000. Ben found his voice first. "That's a fortune, Ruby," Mr. Harlow nodded. "Indeed, it makes you and your children quite wealthy, Miss Redmond. I've been tracking you since learning of Mr. Redmond's death, following your trail from Missouri. The sheriff was kind enough to confirm your identity when I arrived in town this morning." Ruby's mind reeled. The amount of money the lawyer mentioned could change everything, secure her children's future, provide educational opportunities, eliminate the constant worry about survival that had been her companion for so long. "There are papers to sign, of course," Mr. Harlow continued, "and decisions to make about the management of the estate, but the immediate concern is transferring the first portion of funds to you. I've brought a bank draft for $5,000 that you can deposit immediately." Ruby felt Ben's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "This is a lot to take in," he said to the lawyer. "Perhaps Miss Redmond needs some time to consider everything." Mr. Harlow nodded understandingly. "Of course. I'll be staying at the hotel for the next few days. We can meet again when you're ready, Miss Redmond." He handed her a card with his information before gathering his papers. "Sheriff Caldwell knows where to find me." After the lawyer left, Ruby remained seated, staring at the card in her hand. "Ben, is this real? Or am I going to wake up back in that wagon with hungry children and nowhere to go?" Ben knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "It's real, Ruby. You've inherited a fortune." His face showed genuine happiness for her, but something else lurked beneath a question he didn't voice. The same question was forming in Ruby's mind. With this inheritance, she and her children could go anywhere, do anything. The desperate circumstances that had brought them to Deming to Ben no longer existed. "I need to think," she said softly. "Need to understand what this means for us." Ben nodded, rising to his feet. "Of course. Let me take you back to the ranch. The children should hear this news from you." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. Ruby tried to grasp the reality of her changed situation. Just months ago, she had been counting pennies for bread. Now she was apparently wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. When they reached the ranch, Mrs. Holbrook was in the yard hanging laundry while the children helped in their various ways, Emma matching socks, Thomas carrying the empty basket, Jacob solemnly handing clothespins one at a time. "You're home early," Mrs. Holbrook observed, noting their serious expressions. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Ben assured her. "But Ruby has some news to share with the children." Gathering her little ones in the bunkhouse, Ruby explained in the simplest terms she could that a relative they had never met had left them money that would make their lives easier. The children's reactions were mixed. Emma immediately asked if they could buy a new doll for her friend at school. Thomas wanted to know if they were rich enough to buy a horse like Ben's. And Jacob, understanding nothing of the conversation, simply asked for a cookie. Their innocent responses brought tears to Ruby's eyes. To them, wealth meant small comforts and pleasures, not the life-changing implications Ruby was grappling with. After the children returned to their play, Ruby found Ben waiting on the porch of the main house, his expression thoughtful as he watched the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "You've been quiet," she said, joining him at the railing. "Just thinking about how life can change in an instant." He turned to face her. "Yesterday you were building a life here penny by penny. Today you can go anywhere, do anything." There it was, the unspoken question that hung between them. Ruby took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "When Daniel died and I lost the farm, I thought my life was over. The journey west was an act of desperation, not hope." She moved closer to him. But then we arrived in Deming and you opened your door to us. You gave us shelter, food, work, and something I'd forgotten existed. What's that? Ben asked softly. A future worth dreaming about. Ruby reached for his hand. This inheritance changes our circumstances, Ben, but it doesn't change my heart. The money means security for my children, education, opportunities, but what makes a home isn't money, it's people who love each other. Hope dawned in Ben's eyes. What are you saying, Ruby? I'm saying that I love you, Benjamin Caldwell. I've known it for weeks, but was afraid to admit it, afraid to trust in happiness again. She squeezed his hand. The children and I don't need to go anywhere else to find our future. It's right here, if you still want us. Ben's answer was to pull her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of all the emotion he'd held in check for so long. Ruby melted against him, feeling as though she'd finally found her way home after a long, difficult journey. When they finally broke apart, Ben rested his forehead against hers. I want nothing more than to make a life with you and those children, Ruby. Rich or poor, it makes no difference to me. Well, it makes some difference, Ruby said with a smile. Now I can finally buy you a new shirt to replace that one I've mended 3 times. Ben laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. Is that a yes, then? You'll stay in Deming, with me? It's a yes, Ruby confirmed. But Ben, I want to use this money wisely. For the children's education, yes, but also for Deming. This town gave us a second chance. I'd like to give something back. Ben's expression grew thoughtful. The town's been talking about needing a proper school building. The children are still being taught in the back of the church. A school, Ruby repeated, warming to the idea. Emma would love that, and perhaps... She hesitated, then continued, perhaps a clinic as well. If Daniel had had proper medical care, he might have survived his fever. And your Elizabeth too. Ben's eyes softened at her understanding. You've got a generous heart, Ruby Redmond. I learned from the best, she replied, touching his face gently. A man who said his table had room for all of us when we had nothing to offer in return. As the sun sank below the horizon, Ben drew Ruby close again, sealing their future with another kiss. In that moment, all the hardship and sorrow of the past fell away, leaving only the promise of tomorrow, a tomorrow they would build together. The news of Ruby's inheritance spread quickly through Deming, as such news inevitably does in small towns. Most people responded with genuine happiness for the widow and her children, though Ruby noticed a few who suddenly became much friendlier than they had been when she was just the seamstress at Sanders' store. With Mr. Harlow's help, Ruby established accounts for her children's education and made thoughtful plans for the rest of the inheritance. True to her word, she donated a substantial sum toward the building of Deming's first proper schoolhouse, with the stipulation that no child would ever be turned away for inability to pay fees. As winter settled over New Mexico territory, preparations for Christmas began in earnest. For the first time since Daniel's death, Ruby found herself looking forward to the holiday with genuine anticipation rather than dread. The bunkhouse, which had seemed so luxurious compared to their wagon, now felt small with 3 growing children and the collection of toys and books they had accumulated. You know, Ben said one evening as they sat by the fire in the main house, the children playing on the rug before them, this house has 4 bedrooms upstairs and only one of them gets any use. Ruby looked up from her sewing. Benjamin Caldwell, is that your idea of a proposal? Ben had the grace to look sheepish. Not exactly how I planned it, but I suppose it is. He set aside the book he'd been reading and moved to kneel beside her chair. Ruby Redmond, I love you and those children more than I ever thought possible. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of making this house a home again with your laughter and your love? The simple, heartfelt words brought tears to Ruby's eyes. Yes, Ben. Yes, with all my heart. Their kiss was interrupted by Emma's excited squeal. The children, who had been pretending not to listen, abandoned all pretense and rushed to surround them. Does this mean we'll live in the big house? Thomas asked, his eyes wide. Does this mean you'll be our papa now? Emma added, her expression hopeful. Ben looked to Ruby, letting her take the lead with this delicate question. She gathered the children close, including Jacob, who was simply excited because everyone else was. Ben will be your stepfather, she explained gently. Your papa will always be your papa, even though he's in heaven now. But Ben loves you very much and wants to be part of our family. Is that all right with you? Emma nodded solemnly. Papa would like Ben. He always said we should be with someone kind. Thomas considered the matter with the seriousness only a 5-year-old can muster. Will I still get to help with the horses? Ben ruffled the boy's hair. Every day if you want to. Jacob, not to be left out, climbed into Ben's lap and declared, Ben Papa, with the certainty of a child who saw the world in simple truths. Mrs. Holbrook, who had been pretending to be busy in the kitchen but was obviously listening, appeared in the doorway with suspicious moisture in her eyes. Well, it's about time, she declared, hands on her hips. I was beginning to think I'd need to lock you two in the root cellar to get you to speak your minds. The wedding took place on Christmas Eve in Deming's small church, which had been decorated with pine boughs and candles for the holiday. Despite Ruby's newfound wealth, the ceremony was simple and intimate, attended by the friends they had made in their months in the town. Emma served as Ruby's maid of honor, beaming with pride in the new blue dress Ruby had sewn especially for the occasion. Thomas carried the rings on a small pillow, his face a study in concentration as he performed his important duty. Jacob, deemed too unpredictable for an official role, sat with Mrs. Holbrook, who dabbed at her eyes throughout the ceremony. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ben kissed his bride with a tenderness that spoke of all the love that had brought them to this moment. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, Ruby felt a sense of completion, of rightness, that she had feared might never be hers again after Daniel's death. The celebration continued at the ranch, where tables had been set up in the main room and laden with food contributed by seemingly every household in Deming. As Ruby moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, she caught sight of Ben lifting Jacob onto his shoulders, the little boy's delighted laughter rising above the general hum of conversation. He's going to be a wonderful father to them, Mrs. Sanders said, following Ruby's gaze. Those children are blessed twice over, first with the inheritance and now with the sheriff. Ruby smiled, watching as Ben now led Thomas and Emma in some game that involved much giggling and darting between the adults. The money is a blessing, but Ben is a miracle. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep in their new bedrooms upstairs, a transition they had accepted with excitement rather than apprehension, Ruby stood with Ben on the porch, looking out at the star-filled sky. Happy, Mrs. Caldwell? Ben asked, his arm around her waist. Happier than I ever imagined I could be again, Ruby replied honestly. She leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the quiet moment. You know, Ben said after a while, I've been thinking about the ranch. With the railroad coming, Deming's going to grow fast. There might be opportunities to expand, maybe raise more cattle, hire some proper hands. Ruby nodded. The inheritance could help with that. I don't want your money, Ruby, Ben said quickly. What's yours is yours and the children's. And what's mine is yours now too, she countered. We're partners in this life, Ben, in everything. She turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. When I arrived in Deming, I had nothing but 3 hungry children and a desperate prayer. You didn't just feed us for a night, you gave us a future. Let me be part of building our future together. Ben's resistance melted under her earnest gaze. Partners, he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. The years that followed brought changes both to Deming and to the Caldwell family. The railroad's arrival in the spring of 1879 transformed the small town into a bustling community. The new schoolhouse, completed that same year, soon filled with children from both the town and surrounding homesteads. Ruby's investment in the clinic proved equally valuable when a young doctor from Boston decided to settle in the growing town. bringing modern medical knowledge that saved many lives during a scarlet fever outbreak the following winter. The Caldwell Ranch expanded as Ben had envisioned, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Ben eventually passed the sheriff's badge to his deputy, focusing his energies on the ranch and his growing family. For in the summer of 1880, Ruby gave birth to a son they named William, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Sarah. The older children welcomed their half-siblings with enthusiasm, Emma taking on the role of second mother with a seriousness that made both Ben and Ruby smile. Through all the changes and growth, they never forgot how their story began with a desperate widow, 3 hungry children, and a cowboy sheriff who opened not just his home but his heart. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Ben surprised Ruby with a special gift, a small silver locket containing miniature portraits of all their children. As he fastened it around her neck, he whispered, "Do you ever think about how different life might have been if you hadn't stopped in Deming that night?" Ruby touched the locket, thinking of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the loss, the struggle, the desperation that had led to joy beyond measure. "I believe we were meant to find each other, Ben. Some things are just written in the stars." As if to prove her point, a shooting star streaked across the night sky above the ranch. Ben pulled her close, his arms as safe and welcoming as they had been on that first night when he had offered shelter to a family in need. "My table has room for all of you," he had said then, not knowing he was offering not just a meal but a lifetime. And Ruby, who had once been too poor to feed her children, had found not just sustenance but abundance in love, in family, and in the generous heart of a cowboy who had become the center of her world.